good news. Since the last instalment, I fixed all of this panel here. It meant unpicking all of the quilting, as I said I was going to do, and just reorganising the panels so that the white is on this side and the gold is on the inside. All done, all lovely, all ready to go for the next stage. Before I sew the lining together, there's one more job, and it's an item that isn't actually in the pattern, which is this has no inside pockets. This will become my pocket. I'll go into this in more detail in a moment. And we have one of these for each side. And I know I want it roughly there-ish. The best way to find out where your pocket goes is to try your interior on. This is only pinned together, it's not sewed together, but it will give us a good enough idea. Then you will know, when you pin the pocket into place, whether or not it's too high, too low, too far one way or the other. I tell you what, it's not the best idea to be wearing a quilted thing in this weather, but we'll manage. The main thing I put in my pockets is my wallet. So this has dictated the size of the pocket, and that also sort of dictates the location, because once you've figured out the size of the pocket, you are going to be limited on where you can actually put it on your interior. On this one, I've got the pocket in just here. I'm not sure how well that shows up because it's self fabric, and I know that I can comfortably take my wallet and just drop it in my pocket. Once this is sewn in, of course, that will be a little bit easier, and that is a comfortable height for me. It's nice and secure and snug for this, so the wallet's not flopping around or being unsightly inside the jacket and making weird lumps and bumps. I now need to sew this into place, and I've got some techniques I'm using to try and make sure that we don't end up with the lining getting pulled apart when this is sewn in, because any pocket on this sort of material is going to be quite prone to tear over time, because the fabric's not, the strongest thing in the world. Patch pockets are great for this because you have the support all the way around, and of course with this being quilted, we've got this sturdier cotton on the back, which is going to lend some strength to those seams. When you're figuring out the pockets, the main thing you need to know is the main item you're going to have. For most people, that's going to be a mobile phone. For me, it's my wallet. So I need to know that the pocket's going to be big enough for this to comfortably fit and deal with the depth of it, which is, yeah, I don't have a fat wallet, oh well. Anyway, once you've figured that out, you can cut out your square of fabric. Or, if you're using something more delicate, like this fake silk stuff, cut out a rectangle of fabric. Now I've just pressed the fold here. If you double up your layers, it's going to just be a little bit stronger. The other thing that we're adding is some bias binding. Now I've made my own because I want to pick up on this pattern from the outer fabric, and that will go in a moment just on the top of the pocket here. The idea there is this will add some strength so that the pocket is less inclined to bag out, and this is where all the wear and tear happens when you're putting said item in and out of the pocket. This gold fabric isn't particularly tough, but this printed cotton very much is. To build the pocket, the first thing we need to do is turn it inside out and then sew along the two outer edges, but not the top one. You don't need to do that. Turn it the right way out and press. Normally you wouldn't press this line before doing that. I've just done that for the camera, so this would be pressed afterwards. I've put the first pocket together. We've got the strip along the top, and on the inside it's just the same fabric but plain. A little bit of hand sewing involved here. I'll take you through the process in just a moment. You can do all of this on the machine. You don't need to do the hand sewing that I'm going to do. It just gives a slightly nicer finish. So we begin with our freshly pressed and sewn bag. So sewed down these sides, turned it the right way out for the way we're using it, and then pressed it. Now sometimes you find on your seams that they roll a little bit one way or the other, especially with a fabric like this. Now's a great time to pick which side you prefer, and that would be your facing side. Then we will take our bias binding, and the way you make bias binding, if you can't buy the colour or the pattern that you want, is you take a rectangle of fabric, fold it in half and press it, open it back up, and then fold your other pieces into this middle fold that you've made, and you end up with that sort of a shape. Because I'm trying to follow this pattern in the print, that's why my pressing on the inside isn't exactly the same both sides. Make sure you press this nice and firmly. This will work better in some fabrics than others. You don't need to do it on the bias because we're not going around any corners here, which is great. That means I can use the straight line of the print. And the first thing that we need to do is sew these two pieces together. Two different methods here. You can either take the bias binding, folded, insert the bag up to the fold, and then just run one line of stitching along here from one side or the other, whichever you're more comfortable in, and then trim your edges off. That's probably your quickest, easiest way of doing it. I'm going to spend a little bit more time because I want a slightly nicer finish than that. So we open out the bias binding. This is the piece that we want showing with the print, so make sure that's facing the outside of the pocket, and then we will sew along this top line, and as long as you don't sew past your fold line, you'll be fine. There's usually no need to pin or baste on a piece this small, but again, if you're not comfortable just doing it freehand like this, then definitely do pin or baste it. The great thing here is there's no need to do any pressing because you've already done all your pressing when you made the bias binding or bought some bias binding that you're using. So it will naturally fold itself where you want it to be. The key thing you will need to do is just trim off the excess at the end here because that's a little bit too much. You only need about that much sticking out. And what you want to do with that is you fold the sticky out bit into the inside of the bias binding and then fold it down again. It can be a little bit tricky. Do your best just to line everything up so you've got the extra folded over there, and then you fold that as you've pressed the bias binding, and that hides all the raw edges, and when you hand sew that, that will be very nice and tidy. This bit it can help to pin, just saves everything moving around as you're getting everything lined up. What you're aiming to do here is hide that seam that you put in at the top. So if I just peel back the bias binding here, you can see the seam hiding in there, and this just covers that up. And we'll be sewing from here down, across, and then back up on the other side. And that means when you hand sew it, there's no visible top stitching on the outside. It's just a little bit tidier and just looks a little bit more professional. Now that we've finished the pockets, it's time to put them in. And I have a technique for making sure that the pockets are in the right place on both sides. I don't know if it's a proper technique, but it's always worked for me. On this side, I've already pinned it back in where I checked the location. I've also extra double checked that my wallet still fits in there, which it does very nicely. You've got a bit of a gap at the top, so it's not likely to fall out. I will have to be careful with the sewing that I do. I'll be fairly close to the edge on this. A couple of reasons. The first, it makes the pocket as big as it possibly can be, and the second is this is where we've got 4 layers of fabric because of the seam that runs down there. So that's going to be the strongest point to go over. Let's pretend I've already sewn that in, just for now. The next thing to do is take the jacket and basically fold it in half. I know that this panel and this panel line up. So when you lay this seam here matching on both sides of the jacket, you can then peel the side you've not got a pocket on back, and once you see this pocket, you know you're in the right place. So then lay the new pocket down. The quilting that we've done helps as well. That gives us a rough guide of where the vertical line for the grain on the pattern actually is. So I know that this pocket wants to go in around about here. And to be extra sure, I will try this on and double check, and that's very important. Before you do anything permanent, always try things on, always check, move things if you need to move things, because you may have got it wrong, but this should be fine for where that pocket actually goes. Just turn it inside out to make it a little bit easier for you to see what's going on with the pockets, and yeah, they fit quite nicely in these panels. They're just about the right size. It's funny, I thought I'd be putting them higher up on the panel than that, but when I tried that the first time, they were just in the way. So they do have to sit quite low down inside the jacket. I kind of like it this way around as well. It's very sci-fi, and I think that's a lot of fun. Now that we've sorted the lining out, it's time to do the 2 front panels on the jacket, and we've got 4 pockets, a couple of belt loops, and 5 press studs to put in here. On the pattern, all of the markings are already here, and you can transfer this over to your main fabric a number of ways. What I've opted to do first is the press studs. They can be a little bit awkward sometimes. Sometimes they go really easily, but because I find them more frustrating, I thought, do those first. Figure out which one of your cut lines you're on. I'm on 42, because that was nearest to my size. And these little dots here show where your press studs go. Now the way I prefer to do this is I fold back the pattern, because you can see the markings on the reverse here. Lay that flat, it's a bit tricky to do one-handed here, and that will show me where it goes on the inside. You can use tailor's chalk for this if you prefer, or an invisible marker or that sort of thing. I'm using pins because my tailor's chalk doesn't seem to want to stick to this fabric on this side, so it doesn't really help me. Everything's all marked out. I've got my press stud ready. I've got my hammer, because I think I have to use a hammer for this. And let's see how we go. Do you know, there's probably a tool for doing this properly, and I don't have one, so I've got these 2 in on the other side, and they're not great. They work, so it's fine. But never mind. To make the holes, I'm going to use a screwdriver. I need something solid to tap this against to get it go in. I need something with a hole in it, so that's going to be my little driver. I'm sure there's a proper tool for doing this job, I just don't have one. Find the spot. you just very carefully twist the screwdriver and push it through. And then I use a second slightly larger screwdriver just to open the hole up a little bit. Works like a bradawl when you don't have one. And then you want quite a snug fit, so when you push the nub in through, wow, it's really hard to see anything on this fabric, isn't it? I'm sorry about that. But yeah, when you push the nubbing through, you want as tight a fit as you can get on that. And then we pop a little hat on it. And then we try very hard to put this in without destroying it, like I have with my other attempts today. That's much better. You don't want to deform this nubbin in the middle too much, because if you do, you can't get the other half of the socket on. But whatever kind of socket this is, I don't know what kind of socket this is, I never use them, is ideal for these particular press studs, and you end up with a nice finished piece on both sides. So I'll pop the other one in and we will call this job done. I've done a few pieces off camera. I've put the reinforcing stitches in as marked out here, and of course I've put the half of the press studs in that needs to be in there. I've also made the belt loops. I've covered these before in the trouser videos. Same process, very simple. So now we're moving on to the small pocket that has the flap on the front of the jacket, and it is just a case of following, in some ways, your reinforcing stitching on here, because these will also serve as a guide for placements on items. So we've got belt loop down here, that's one end of a pocket, and that's the other end. This is the flap pocket we're going to do, and its associated press stud there. And it's just a case of take your time, follow your instructions, and you should be okay. Right, we've got the pocket on, and I've followed the instructions. I was expecting this press stud here to join up with this and it be flat like that, but it's not actually like that. When the press stud's on, it folds more like that, which is fine. We've got the welt here. This is a strengthening piece which stops you pulling the fabric and making it baggy. Obviously this is the flap that goes on the top. All of this is basted down onto the fabric, or tacked if you prefer. The flap has got top stitching. I opted to go with black rather than the pink. It's very busy already, and I thought the pink might be just a little bit too much here. And now we just have to put the pocket bag on. I've marked my centre line with 2 pins, and they line up with the gap between the welt on the bottom and the pocket flap on the top. And this is probably the fiddliest part of it all, because we have to sew a box in here so that we can cut this out, sew this together and put it all on the inside. Again, I'm not going to go into this in detail here. I'm just going to get it done, and hopefully it goes very smoothly. It is done. Almost. I've just got the other half of the press stud to put on here. It looks okay, you know. You can just see the gold lining in there. The welt for the edge. Again, I picked up some of this print going through the fabric just to do this edge, just to make it, you know, a little bit fancier. Picked out a little piece there. Same with the belt loops. They've got that same print on them. Little details like that make things look a bit more professional. However, I'm going to be honest with you, this did not go well. I don't like doing welt pockets, because when you do these edges here, cutting it out, you've got to be so precise, and your sewing has to be so precise as well, that if you're off even a tiny bit, it doesn't work. And unfortunately, I got my cut slightly wrong on both ends, so I had to resort to a little bit of hand sewing to hide it. It's not going to matter for what I'm making here. I'm happy enough with it. It's up to the standard I need it to be, and that's important to remember with sewing. The other thing that is a little bit annoying is the reinforcement stitching that you put in here. I genuinely struggle to understand why it's in there. Because you do that much sewing to put this in, I don't know why you would want to spend the extra time doing that when you could just put some marks in to tell you where to put things. So when I make another one of these in a different fabric, I don't think I'll bother with that. I think I'm going to call this panel done. And the reason I say that is the pattern calls for another zip on here to go in there. And honestly, I think it's too much. I'm very much a proponent of more is more, but it just looks daft. You've got a pocket here, you've got another pocket here, I've added pockets to the inside as well. Having yet another pocket up here, I don't need it, and I don't think it adds anything to the design. In fact, if anything, I think it takes away from the design because you'd cut into a lot of the printed area here, which I don't want to do. Also gives me a little bit less work, so that's nice. The way you put these in is odd to me because, I mean, it looks alright, you know, it functions, which is great, but it leaves the zipper tape exposed on the inside, and I've had a look at my other jackets and that's not how they're done. This zipper tape disappears inside between the outer and the lining. But it is easy to do this way. And honestly, you're never going to really tell. So I'm happy enough with the patterns method of doing the zipper pockets. I've only got one more to do for the other side. And since I've done this side, well, I should probably show you that, shouldn't I? I'll show you this on the back of the fabric because it's just a bit easier to see. These stitches here and these stitches here mark where the pocket begins and ends, and this is our zip. Now in the pattern, for some reason, it suggests taking off the stops on each end of the zip. I haven't done that. I don't know why you would do that. I'm going to save myself the trouble. And the zip eventually will go into the fabric that way around. I'm going to have to turn this over to make sure I get the cut for the zip in the right place. So I want to make sure that the bottom bar and the top of where the zip goes to is the very extremity of the pocket hole. If I make it bigger than that, you're going to see the tail ends of the zip, which we don't want to. Ideally, you want to make it just a smidge smaller if you can. It does look like the stitches I've put in are pretty much exactly where they need to be, which is nice. So I'll just put my marker pins in, and then very carefully cut a straight line from this pin to this pin in the middle. And I do not like doing this bit. I'm not cutting all the way to the pins for one very good reason. I can now put my zip behind the fabric and line it up with where I want it to be and see whether or not I actually do need to cut a little bit more. And you can see I do. There isn't quite enough here. But that's why we do it this way. Remember, with your fabric, it's always easier to take away than it is to put back, so always be a little bit cautious whenever you're doing things like this. Until you have just the fit you want. Right, I think that will be just about right. Now the fun bit. We've got the slit for the zip cut out, so we know where our centre line is. Take one of the pocket bags and fold it in half. Mark where your fold is with a couple of pins again, and lay it out flat. And you want this to line up with where you made that cut in the fabric. This is actually genuinely impossible to show you because the fabric goes over what I would show you. That looks about there. And just roughly pin the bag in place, because we're not sewing from this side. We're sewing from this side, because I want to try and keep as close as I can to the slot I cut for the zip to give us the best fit. I need to see where I need to sew, which is why we pin on this side. This is slightly different to the pattern. The pattern would have you sew the area and then cut it out, which is fine, that works too, but I'm after a very specific sort of a thing here, so it's just a slightly different method. And make sure, if you're going to do a continuous seam as I am here, that your pins all go in the same direction. A number of times I've been caught out with that, and still get caught out with that, and I'm sure if you've been sewing any amount of time, you will too. Apologies for the air conditioner noise in the background, it is what it is. Once you've sewn round the slot, you want to trim through the pocket bag and from here to the corners, but don't go through your stitches. And then pull the pocket bag through to the inside. At this point I would suggest pressing it. It gets these top edges nice and flat, and it will then make pinning the zip in place a lot easier. So I'll just quickly go and do that, and I'll bring you back when I've got the zip on. The zip is pinned in, and I find it easiest to do it this way. So you lay the zip on your table and then put your fabric over the zip. It's much easier to get your zip located where you want it then. And on the back, you can see all that you do with the zip is you just lay it over the pocket bag. And when this is sewn up, it goes like so. And it does sort of hide things. I'm still not a big fan of doing it this way, but it is easy, it's functional, it will do what I need it to do. It's another day. It's a lot cooler today. We've got some cloud cover, so that's making this job a little bit more pleasant. I want to finish off the front panel on the jacket to try and finish off this video, and to do that I need to shorten the zip. I've already shortened this side. You can see how much shorter it is. I've pulled the teeth off, and you can actually, if it's the right kind of zip, unbend the cap at the top here and reattach it. A stop still works there, just gives me a longer ribbon which I can deal with when I sew things together. And this is what we need to take off. First job is take off this little brass nubbin at the top. And the way I did that before was wedge a screwdriver in and just pry it off. There we go. And that's the piece that we're saving because we need to put that back on. It is best as well to use some smooth jawed pliers for this sort of work if you can, because that won't then mess up the surface. when you reattach this. Speaking of, before you do that, you do need to open this up so that you stand a chance of it going back on. The way I have opted to do it is a selection of screwdrivers. You might find as well, even when you've opened that up that far, you may have to just manipulate it a little bit further to get it back on the zip. Put this aside, you'll need that. And now we just start pulling teeth. There we are. They should just pull off. Wow, this side's much more stubborn. Anyway, to give you an idea, what normally happens is you grab them and then they just pop off. And you can see they have the little legs and they crimp over the tape on the zip. I'm actually going to put these in my miniatures bits box because I think they might be handy in the future. I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out, to be honest with you. All the pockets are in and working, which is super. And they've got that nice metal zip sound. And the lapel will fold out something like that. Obviously no lining at the moment, but we'll come to that. I've pressed and top stitched along where the zip goes here. There isn't really anything else to do on the front now. The only thing that's left will happen when the lining goes in, which is we put the press studs in up here on the corners.